And we had to go through a number of thinking processes to sort of get there. For the most part, when I was talking to the authors of the catalog, I told them that they were forbidden to use the word post-colonial. I felt that using the word post-colonial sort of mired us in the past and didn't allow us to move into the future. But on the other hand, I didn't want to be naive about the effects of the colonial system, on Africa. So we went through a lot of thinking about what were the impacts of post-colonial and what was actually happening in the field. Then when you take a post-colonial approach to Africa, economically, you have two models. You have investment, mostly by the West, and you have aid, which is also given by the West. So essentially, we realized that investment meant that the money was going to stay up in the upper echelons and never get to the people. And aid was a kind of welfare that was beginning to be critiqued by many young black economists. But when you look at sort of art, craft, and design, what you realize was that there was another alternative to this, because they were the entrepreneurs. They were sort of creating things out of nothing on their own, sometimes with the help of a NGO or an outside organization. So we took the model of Hernando Soto, who you may know, who is an economist in Peru, who talked about the third path. And he was talking about the ability of people coming from the countryside into the cities to sort of create their own systems. If you didn't have a bus system, if you didn't have a banking system, they were sorted. So he called it the third path. And what it began to sort of reveal to us was that the creative sector that we're all involved in actually pumps billions of dollars into the economy of many countries, but nobody ever counts it. Nobody ever really has done serious kinds of impact, because people think of the creative sector, think of arts and crafts as something that's frivolous and not really important. But the other thing that we got into, which we'll talk about as we move through this presentation, is that particularly craft was a modality by which poor women in Africa could support their whole community, whole families, particularly in communities that were devastated by AIDS. So what I found was that I'm essentially a dumb art historian. I'm becoming an economist. I am really looking at art not just as something to put on the wall, but as something that begins to sort of have an economic component and an economic reverberation in life. Next one. So as Leslie and I were trying to sort of figure out how to organize all this diverse material, one of the designers sent us an article he was featured in. Now, he was doing this because for pure self-promotion, essentially. But I started reading the article, and it was a feature called African Thought Leaders. And it was all interviews with people involved in design in Africa. So it could be actual designers, it could be economists, it could have been a government minister, or it could have been an educator. So I'm reading this article, and I called up my friend Leslie, and I said, I'm emailing you an article. We're going to read it together, because this article is going to give us our themes for our exhibition. So we found out several things that were really of concern for Africans. The first thing is education. There were no models for teaching design that were not based on old European models. So nobody had ever really sort of developed a theory of African design. So what do you do about that? Then there was also the whole issue of how to sort of get materials to make their products. And as in many places in the world, if you start importing materials that are used for design, say the United States and Europe, you're paying a lot of money, it doesn't become cost effective, and you can't do it. So what do? The other question was then, how do you get your stuff produced? You don't have any factories. You don't have, like any sort of like mechanical ways to do it. And then finally, how do you get your work onto the global market, out of Africa into a global market? So out of this, we devised these themes for the exhibition. One was intersecting cultures. Intersecting cultures was talking about the fact that there is no pure Africa, because Africa has been trading with Asia, with the West, and they're global citizens, and they are sharing their culture, and they're bringing culture in. So we looked at how that came together. We also looked at transforming traditions, because we realized that because of the ways that they had to get their work produced, many African designers were relying on traditional craftspeople and artisans to sort of do their work. But in the process, as they're doing their work, and I know many of you who I've talked to about design here in Chile understand this, as they're doing their work, they are transforming the traditional work because there's an exchange of ideas. So tradition is not a static thing. Then the other one was competing globally. How do you get your work on the global market? And then sourcing locally. How can you use materials that are within your country that you don't have to import or export, that you can sort of use? And one sort of minor theme that came out of this was the fact that the oil industry provided a lot of material for African designers, because there was more furniture being made out of oil barrels than, like any place that I had ever seen. And then because African designers were interested in working with communities, they were also interested in how their design built communities. And then finally, we added one topic ourselves, which was branding content, because as you saw with the Kim Schmaman screen, we began to sort of realize that a lot of the design had content beyond just what is a chair. It was like, what is a chair and why are you sitting in it, and what is the material made out of, and how did the material get there, and who was being exploited and who was being, sort of promoted and supported. So we realized that a lot of this work had a lot of content. So now I'm going to just show you a few examples. I can't show you everything. We'd be here all night, and I don't want to keep you here all night. So this is Intersecting Cultures. This is Cheryl Riley, who is a designer from the United States. She has a studio in New Jersey. She works a lot with many sort of prominent celebrities like Whoopi Goldberg and people like that. And these are two examples of her work where you can sort of see with the mirror on the left that she is sort of absorbing ideas of assemblage and sort of accumulation that's very much a part of traditional African art. And then on the chest on the bottom, you not only have a geometric pattern, which is vaguely, reminiscent of Africa, but you have these wonderful kind of elephant feet at the foot of it with little beads around the ankles that sort of give it a very sort of human aspect to it. I also decided to work with Missoni because Missoni has had a very interesting history with Africa. The piece on the left, I was organizing the exhibition in 2010 when the World Cup was going to be in South Africa. 20 years earlier, in 1990, the World Cup was in Milano. And Missoni did an African theme. They sort of made up African designs and did an African-themed fashion show that went with the World Cup. So that is a photograph, and we had an example of one of those costumes. It's a generic kind of Africa that sort of brings together a lot of patterns, and we had a video of the original fashion walk, and it was like really incredible. But then I also was remembering that Stephen Burks, who's an African-American designer, had worked with Missoni to sort of do these kinds of pattern vases. So it was a way of looking at Smithsonian in the past and then moving into the future and how they were sort of interacting with two kind of components of Black culture. And then I mentioned Serge Minogue, who was our Cameroon guy in Japan, who was making these kimonos out of African print. And so I said to him, we had this long conversation on the phone, and I said, so Serge, are you getting your prints done in China like everybody else? And he said, no, Lowery, I get them from Holland. I said, you get them from Velisco? And he said, yes. One of the things we found out in this project, and I didn't even know, was that for the last almost 150 plus years, all the fabrics in West Africa are made by a Dutch company. And they probably were originally printed in Indonesia. I don't know if they still are. And there are many artists now who are very familiar to you, like Yinka Shonobare, who have done a whole thing about Dutch wax-dyed prints being a part of a kind of African aesthetic. So what they did was they sort of took this whole concept of Africa as a global entity and kept pushing it back and really making us realize that we were on the right track because this had a long tradition. So this is an example of Serge. We had a couple of his kimonos that we showed, and this is a part of Velisco. Now the Velisco story also has an interesting kind of side story. I had a number of fashion pieces for the exhibition, and I kind of realized as we were reaching the time to install the show that my colleague had not gotten any mannequins. And I said, why didn't you get them? She says, I thought you were getting the mannequins. So I called up the head of the Costume Institute of the Metropolitan Museum, my old home, and I said, Harold, you have to help me. So he says, Lowery, I can send you 9 mannequins, but they're all white. I said, I don't care. So we brought them down, and then we had this idea that we would paint them brown, but the surface was laminated, and there was no way you could. So I said, look, just put the costumes on it. It doesn't. But it would not work for Velisco, because the representative of Velisco, who I was dealing with, emailed me every day for 3 months saying, our dress must go on a Black mannequin. So I had to come up with 1,200 American dollars and buy a Black mannequin, because that's how strongly they felt about protecting their brand. They were not marketing to Europeans or to white people. They were marketing to Africans, and they wanted to make sure that that was clear with their kinds of with the costume. Next, and this is a piece by Nick Cave. He's an artist. You might have seen his work from Chicago. These are pieces called sound pieces. They evoke a number of masquerade traditions from Africa, from Asia, and I put in a photograph to sort of show how they actually move, because he dances in them, and they're not. So we had a video in front of the piece that sort of showed them in motion. This is a very interesting, I talked about, remember you saw the guy in the pink suit with the red hat at the beginning? And this whole sense of male elegance is a very kind of African thing. There's a well-known expert on African art in the States, Robert Ferris Thompson, who developed this concept. So I remembered back to my father, to my uncles, to the men I grew up with who were African American, and they always dressed impeccably. Now, part of this was because historians have traced it to the fact that when slaves were freed, particularly up in the United States, how you distinguished yourself from being a slave was first thing you did was you got a suit and you got a new clothes, and it sort of symbolized moving into a new state of sophistication and freedom. This is a work by E.K. Ude, who sort of takes the sophistication and the sense of style to the extreme. He literally curates his personas, creating them out of different elements that he finds around his house, so that you can sort of see that in the left, he's combined an African hat with this kind of collar that looks like Dutch 17th century. The collar is actually made out of filters. So it's like very inventive in the use of material. And then he has a stuffed rooster, whatever that's supposed to mean, but it's creating this kind of persona. And he sort of plays games about how men dress and how women dress. And he calls, his theory is called sartorial anarchy. It's about taking the sense of fashion and creating anarchy with our expected ideas. Transforming traditions, next one. Now, I'm showing you at the top a pot by Nestanala and a basket by Ruben and Ndwandwe. This is very important because among the Zulu, the women make the pots, the men make the baskets. Go to the second line. You see a pot by a man and a basket by a woman that I've already showed you. So one of the things that we learned was that even within tradition, you had a lot of cross-dressing going on. That people were sort of crossing gender roles and sort of making a kind of difference that was really very interesting. This is the example of the city quilts on the lower right that you could see. And you can see that it's made up of all these kinds of strips and bits of color. But look how, compare it to a quilt that's made in Alabama in the United States. The similarity was breathtaking. That, you know, two groups of Africans in two different parts of the world could approach quilting in a very similar way. I sort of basically decided to extend the whole idea of design to head covering and to hair. Because in Africa, as you can see by the upper left, the way that women tie their headscarves can have a great deal of flourish, and the design begins to sort of indicate your status in life, your skills, and also who your family is. So I looked to sort of find a comparable thing in the United States, and I found this hat by Yvette Petty that was up in Harlem. Now, if you know anything about Black American culture, you know that a Black woman would never go to church or a formal event without a hat. And people have published books that call the hats their crowns. You know, they have to cover that. And it's really a translation of the African over into the United States. These are photographs by Ch.ACO13, who has been documenting hairstyles and head wraps in West Africa for 30 years. So the lower right, you have a very elaborate hairstyle. All the hairstyles have names. They, you know, like they have dates. They're sort of current. And again, at the same time I'm organizing the exhibition, there is a show on television called Hair Spectacular. And it was really talking about all the contemporary competitions about hair. Now, it started in the Black community, and now it's spread out to everybody. And so I thought it was lovely that we could show a very traditional hairstyle with one that comes from Hair Wars that we sort of see on the right. This is just another way of sort of showing how two artists working independently could sort of create a thing about a hat and the head and the gele in two different materials, Sonia Clark and Olu Amoda. Okay, now we have to competing globally. This is really the sort of section of the artists that have sort of, and the designers who sort of really made it on the international stage. One is Cheikh Diallo in Mali. He also works in France. And the chair on the right was made for a very well-known exhibition of African art called Africa Remix. So it's called the Africa Remix chair. And this is, on the left, is a more contemporary piece. These chairs are made out of wire and rope, and he employs craftspeople in West Africa to sort of create the chairs. So this is a case of a designer on the international stage using local talent and local skills to make their work. This is one of my favorite stories. Bibi Sek and his wife Aisha Bassel have a design firm. Bibi is from France, and his parents are from Senegal and Martinique. He went to Senegal, and he found this woman on the left who probably has one of the few factories in Africa that processes plastic, recycling plastic. Now, the plastic is sorted by a women's cooperative in one town. It's brought to Dakar, where she usually makes water tanks and different kinds of septic tanks. He got the idea of employing her to sort of use them to make these kinds of stools, which are low-lying stools that sort of reflect traditional African stools. And I thought it was like the most incredible example of how a women's cooperative in one town, a woman owning a factory in Africa, which is practically unheard of, working with a designer from the United States to sort of create something out of recycled materials. We also have the example of Peter Mabeyo in Botswana, who works with different designers like Patricia Johnson and Patricia Urquiola from Spain to sort of produce their work. So he's essentially the factory for these designers. Taslim Martin, sort of really showing how the African Ashanti stool that you can sort of see on the upper left and some kente cloth sort of really influenced his designs on the marketplace. Now, sourcing locally. One of the most interesting things that we found was this chandelier that's literally made out of mud. And it's made by a studio in South Africa. And it's one of those things where it just sort of takes your sense of value. When we think of chandeliers, we think of crystals, we think of shiny things. But what is it to make it out of mud? It sort of really sort of destabilizes our value system. I talked about the fact that the oil industry provided much material for artists. Here are two pieces by Ousmane Mbaye from Senegal, a cabinet and sort of a traditional table, all made out of metal from recycled oil barrels. Ramul Hazame has a talent for taking containers that they carry oil in to sort of make things, turn them 90 degrees and make them into things that look like African masks. The backstory to this is that 90% of the oil that is in Benin is brought illegally across the border from Nigeria by men who literally put hundreds of these plastic containers on their backs and bicycle it across. I was looking at a work by Pablo Rivera that was at the Museum of Contemporary Art where he was talking about the water thing. Well, imagine it full of oil. These guys risk their lives because one wrong step, they go up in flames. But 90% of the oil from Benin goes across from Nigeria in that way. We're talking about Olu Amoda again. Olu sort of has a sideline where he makes security gates. He does sculpture, but he also makes security gates for wealthy people in Lagos. So I wanted him to make essentially a screen. So what he did was he sent over a shipment of nails. He wanted to have nails from houses that had been destroyed in the Civil War. He assembled the nails, and then I found a studio on Long Island for him to work, and then he made this gate that just was fit in front of our window here. Again, this whole idea of materials having meaning that are getting translated from one spot to another, the difficulties of getting him a visa so he could come and sort of make the piece in the United States in time for the exhibition, and then also the financial challenge of finding an opportunity where he could have a welding studio and he could live. It was going to cost me $200 an hour to rent a studio in Brooklyn. But then I had a hunch, and I called up a friend of mine who's a sculptor out on Long Island, named Billy Omabeho. And come find out, he and Olu are from the same village in Nigeria, so I got a bargain. For $300 a day, he had unlimited access to the studio, meals, and a place to sleep. Now, one of the things about building communities, I talked about the fact that crafts have become a way for women in particular in Africa to sort of sustain themselves and their communities. What I found out was that the United Nations had been tracking this since the 1960s because they realized that many women were being uprooted from their traditional roles with urbanization, with war, after liberation and things. But it's hard to find the material because it's buried under economic policy. And you have to sort of like really look at the indexes to find the material. This is the Gahaya Links Weaving Association from Rwanda. It was founded by two sisters, Joy Ndagutsi and her sister, I'm blanking out on her sister's name, but they are two Rwandan women who came back to Rwanda after the genocide and brought together Hutu and Tutsi women to work together. What they did was, when you see at the upper right, that is a traditional basket that many of the groups in Rwanda make. They're made by the women. They are sort of like for special events and things. They took that skill, did a survey of the international market, and began to sort of market these baskets through stores like Macy's in the United States and a couple of stores in London. From 2004, they went from 20 women to now supporting over 44,000 weavers throughout Rwanda and sort of really keeping them alive, and at the same time bringing together two groups of people who were killing each other at one point. Zenzulu is another example. There's an interesting book on baskets in Africa that was put out by the Museum of African Art about 2 years ago. And they wanted to talk about the telephone wire baskets. It seems that at some point, in South Africa with apartheid, people were conscripted to come into the cities to do work. They were put up in the townships. They're far away from, the grasslands. They have no materials. They want to make a basket. So what did they do? They started cutting the telephone wire and taking it down so that it would cut off all the telephone calls. So finally, the telephone company said, please do not cut our wires. We will sell you the wire. And it did. But the interesting thing is that by using telephone wires, it introduced a whole new palette into a traditional form, a whole new ability to make open forms that you couldn't do very, easily with the grass. And this is another cooperative that sort of has a worldwide marketplace for all their work. On your right, you see a necklace by Ch.ACO13. I had seen his work in a catalog for a design show, Africa Design Show, that had been done in 2004 by the Museum of African Art in New York. I searched the internet to find Ch.ACO13 and finally gave up. Why I was interested in his work is that he makes beads out of paper. He rolls up the paper to make beads and does them in this kind of very interesting way. So fast forward, it is 5 months before the opening of my show. The catalog is going to press. I get a telephone call from an artist friend of mine who says, Lowery, I have something for the exhibition. You have to come up and see it now. And I'm saying, Algernon, I cannot put anything else in the exhibition. My assistant will kill me. So I go up, and he shows me this thing on the upper right. It is a huge 8 feet by 10 feet, so it's 3 meters by 4 meters or something like that. And it's essentially a tapestry made out of paper beads. So I said, wow. So I'm calling up my assistant. Please, 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 can we just do it? If I bring the JPEGs and I bring the thing, can we just do it? So the best part of the story is that he went to a craft fair and saw beads made by a group of women in Uganda, but they were making little bags. He was intrigued by the beads. So he had the woman who was selling the beads put him in touch with the group in Uganda. She had just sent over to them a shipment of campaign literature from the Obama campaign. And that is what all those beads are made out of. So my best delight when the exhibit, and there's just enough in it for you to understand it. And the best moments of the exhibition is when somebody would approach it, and I knew they were a Republican. I knew they would be a Republican. And they'd be looking at the beads, and then they'd see, yes, we can, Obama. And then they step back and they go, oh. But how I found Ch.ACO13 was that Algernon had a film that he made of the women. And Algernon never went to Uganda. This was the interesting thing. He never went to Uganda. He did this all through Skyping, iPad, and computer, all right? Because everybody in Africa, no matter where they live, they have an iPhone somewhere, okay? So he's showing me this film, the women are making the beads, and there's this man in the middle of it. I said, who's the guy? He said, that's Ch.ACO13. And I said, I had been looking for Ch.ACO13 for 3 years, and I finally found him. So I contacted him, and he made this necklace especially for the exhibition. This was the best part about working on this, was that you had so many interesting interactions and stories, and trying to follow the train of a story, trying to find an individual was just like the most exciting thing. And when you found him, it was like gold. The other thing about communities was how much in Africa, and I suspect here in Latin America also, there are these kinds of designer, and we call them in English tinkerers, people who just fix things and put things together and sort of invent things, making them out of recycled materials. So there is an organization called Maker Faire, and there are Maker Fairs in Europe, there are Maker Fairs in the United States. I don't know if they're in Latin America, but there's a guy who started Maker Faire Africa, and he brings together all these little tinkering inventors, and they sort of, have a fair, and they sort of exchange ideas. One of the people who was part of it was William Kamkwamba, and they wrote a book about him. He was a guy in Malawi who just tinkered, picked up, found objects, and he made a windmill so that his town could get water. Just not knowing anything about engineering or anything, just sort of like really inventing. And that kind of inventiveness was something that we wanted to celebrate in the exhibition. So we come to branding content. Now this got to be very interesting because we decided to sort of look how logos play out in sort of like the diaspora of Africa. So on the one hand, you have this guy in Benin wearing a Nike t-shirt. We don't know where he got the Nike t-shirt. We don't even know if he can afford a pair of Nikes, but he's got a Nike t-shirt because he recognizes the brand. Hank Willis Thomas did this very provocative photograph where he photoshopped the Nike swoosh onto the torso of a black male, sort of creating this very metaphorical statement about the exploitation of black men in sports for economic, means. So this was like an interesting thing. The other sort of logo we looked at, we could have put many logos, looking at Hank Willis Thomas, who put together the logos of Ebony Magazine and Life Magazine to sort of create the word Ebony Life, talking about that sort of lifestyle. And then two works by Lyle Ashton Harris. The photograph, again, shows as the Nike, somebody just wearing the logo of Ebony in Ghana. Whether he's ever read Ebony, we don't know, but he has the t-shirt. The painting is even more interesting. It's a painting, obviously, of Michael Jackson. It is a painting that Lyle did in a collaboration with a popular sign painter in Ghana. It reproduces the cover of Ebony from December 2007 of Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson died in 2009. The incredible thing is that this painting, you see the big sort of medallions of black. They are motifs of skulls from African print. He painted it 2 years before his death on a death pattern and a paint. So it was like this kind of eerie, kind of prescient thing. I also wanted to sort of talk about how hip hop had, an interesting relationship around branding. And one of the first groups to understand it was the Wu-Tang Clan. This was a early rap group that was very influenced by Chinese martial arts. And they created this logo and this clothing line that sort of really talked about them. And I think this is maybe the last one. This was product from the 2010 World Cup by Kehinde Wiley. He not only did a portrait of Samuel Eto'o, who's from the Cameroons, who was considered the top soccer player of the year, but also did sneakers and sort of translated his portrait style into shirts to sort of really talk about that. So we had a very interesting response to the exhibition. I mean, we knew we were being very provocative. People questioned the idea of treating Africa as a single place. Also, they noticed that we had so much stuff in it and it was all so different that it really sort of, challenged the idea of order and organization that you expect in museum organizations. But Roberta Smith thought that maybe that kind of neat packaging in museums was overrated. And they talked about how there was no look or single style that emerged, and that was our purpose. People used to ask me, tell me about your exhibition. What is the story? Tell me in 10 seconds. And I said, I can't tell you in 10 seconds because I have 97 artists and 97 stories. So don't even. If you got an hour, I'll tell you. And I just wanted to show you a few examples of the installation. You can sort of see it was jam-packed. I admit we had too many things, but we couldn't resist it. Putting everything together from a quilt next to a chair, next to a stool, next to, a kind of costume. I think that the most interesting review I was interested in was from South Africa, where Nadine Botha was talking about the fact that instead of talking about, each country in Africa, we were talking about Africa as a concept and an idea rather than a continent or a place. And I used to say that we were treating Africa as a psychic space rather than as just a purely physical one. And I think that she was also appreciative of showing how the artists that we had were resourceful and innovative and sort of really showed how people were reacting to the crisis of their lives and, really making solutions. I think one of the most moving reactions I had was from Joy Ndugutsi when I first showed her a kind of version of the exhibition, and she burst out into tears. She said, because when people think of Africa, they think of rape, genocide, blood diamonds, war, and you're showing the positive side of how people are making solutions and moving on. So, and here's another couple of slides. All right, so this brings me to my current project, which is a kind of continuation of this in sort of looking at something that's called Global Latin America. So I knew I was going to get in trouble for this. So what I did was this time I put together a advisory committee of all my friends who were Latin American and who design, art, and craft. So I'd have a buffer. I said, it's not me, the colored girl, doing this, it's these Latin Americans. But so we spent a lot of time of sort of deciding where Latin America was. That was the most interesting conversation that we had, because I realized that Latin America is different from South America, There was always questions of whether we should include the Caribbean. Then there was even questions if we should include Mexico. I remember somebody said, you can't include Mexico because they sold out when they signed the NAFTA treaty. And then I sort of said, but hello. And then I had all the French, Dutch, Danish, and English-speaking people of South America saying, why aren't we on the show? I said, I'm sorry, we're just going to do Spanish and Portuguese. But then I had the frickin' Brazilians saying, well, you know, maybe we're not part of Latin America. And I went, you're 3/4 of the continent. How can you not be part of Latin America? So that was like the most interesting conversation we had of where is Latin America. So the idea of this show is, again, to look at contemporary trends and ideas in design, craft, and art from the Spanish and Portuguese communities of South, Central America, Mexico, the Caribbean, and the United States, and maybe even Europe since 2000, because that's where we find all these kinds of creators. Now, the interesting problem I'm having is the relationship between the Mexicans and the Mexican Americans. And we're trying to sort of figure out how we're going to navigate la frontera between the United States and Mexico, where there is a lot of border activities going on, people doing craft workshops that are really talking about being in between spaces and sort of doing that kind of divide. So we'll see how that comes. So our challenges was, okay, defining Latin America, determining the time frame, determining the thematic organization, and determining a title change. I decided that Global Latin America was like, it didn't say anything and nobody knew what it was. So the other thing was to sort of identify issues. I've been working on this exhibition for a year. It's not quite finished. It'll probably open a year from now, so I still have some time to work it out. But some of the issues that have come up were the migration of traditional craft and artisan work into the mainstream through collaborations with artists and designers, the mediation of objects through manipulation and recycling, the language of form and high design, and then adaptive strategies in the habitations of one's body, architecture, and urban spaces. So where we're at this moment is that we did change the title. We changed it to New Territories, Design, Craft, and Art from Latin America 2000 to 2013. The title itself comes from a quote from the Italian designer Gaetano Pesce. He had a booth at the Collective Art Fair in New York, and he had a wonderful long quote. I'm sorry I didn't bring it with me, but he was talking about the fact that if art and design could sort of really realize how close they were, that it would open up new frontiers and new territories. So at first I wanted to call it New Frontiers, but then I had two assistants, one's from Colombia and one's from Argentina, and we sat down and we talked about it. And I was thinking about how it would translate into Spanish. And so I said, so what's La Frontera in Spanish? And I remember Antonio was from Colombia. He says, it's not a good place, Lowery. So I said, okay, we won't call it Frontera. We'll just, and we sort of realized it's a new territory because the designers are opening up new territories. And it's also a new territory for the museum because this is the first show that we're doing of this type. We're still working on it, but I'll show you a few people who we're looking at. This is Pedro Baray from Paraguay, who makes furniture and then ships it up to the Indians, and they burn their tattoos and their myths into part of the design. This is Liliana Ovalle, who did a cooperative project with Colectivo 1050 Degrees with the artisans in Oaxaca. And this is called the Sinkhole Project. Some more barrel furniture made from oil barrels. These are designs done by Rolando Peña from Venezuela. And this is a piece by Lucia Cuba, who's from Peru. It's on Artículo 6, which was legislation that was introduced during the Fujimori administration that mandated sterilization of certain groups to sort of keep them from reproducing. So this is from her graduate show at FIT. So she's referencing traditional women's clothing and she's printed on there the text of the legislation, and then there's another print where she has Fujimura, she has USAID, so she's like really indicting all the people who were involved in this. GT2P from Chile. And then this is Carlos Torres, who's working from Colombia and Sweden. But I was interested in him because he was a car designer, and this is a off-terrain vehicle that he designed for Colombia. And then the top thing is a sort of machine for borrowing hulls from mining, and I figured mining is an important thing. This is an artist I found in Mexico, Gilberto Esparza, who does essentially, and you can see how small the drones get, you know, like little flies. So it's almost like Transformers 1, 2, and 3, you know, on the whole thing. And then I mentioned Coco Fusco. This is a video she did on the Plaza de la Independencia in Havana, but looking at it empty, not when the crowds are there, when Fidel is looking at it.